So ultimately, cognition is essentially an interface with and for action or behavioral actions. Of course, we have reflexes and visceral responses or involuntary actions. That those could be internal and external to the skin. But also we have volitional, voluntary mannerisms or actions, musculoskeletal actions, that are sent directly from frontal cortical regions and motor command neurons in the frontal cortex. And that would include pretty much the whole repertoire of voluntary actions, okay, and including obviously things like walking and moving and so on, but also body language, facial expressions, the actual vocalization of speech, all of this, kind of moving around in social interactions, and all of this is under the umbrella of understanding motor neuroscience and all the way to behavioral mimetics and cognition of action input-output sequences. And one key fact to bear in mind is that remember, we have 100 billion neurons interconnected by 100 trillion synapses. These are approximate numbers, but it's on that scale, on that order of magnitude. So the number of permutations and combinations of neural activity can never be easily predictable. And this, again, we go back to the whole free will thing here, because essentially the aim of theoretical neurobiology and biophysics and cognitive systems and psychology, looking at things like engineering analyses as well in the physical sciences, the aim is to essentially decipher how these algorithms work. So things like the kind of winner-take-all decision-making protocols, or things like reinforcement learning, how that works in the brain, the decision tree processes, understanding that in terms of neural structures. So essentially, my whole thing is to what academics and researchers and associates are doing is that we're trying to bridge a gap from the kind of basic input to the throughput to the output and back to the input. And that becomes much more complicated. It's a circular system, and we have to understand, how not just these processes, but also how the systems work given limited resources being available. So whether it be limited information inputted to a cognitive neural system, things like limited money, limited resources, limited food, or limited energy, whether it be physical effort or cognitive effort. So again, this goes back to the kind of Bayesian contextual influences, modulating those input-output sequences, and it's something that is being researched quite a lot. So we also need to understand belief updates and social interactions as being an extension of sensory-motor integration, except it's much more complex, and there are so many more cofactors involved. So lots of examples of this. So if we look at, for example, psychosocial interactions in terms of how people assign cost effectiveness, how they assign value to intellectual capital. So that could be, that's a huge topic of interest within the whole idea of group theory in developmental psychology or developmental neuroscience and social interactions, all the way to understanding things like equilibrium states in economic game theory and game theoric model within the economic sphere. And again, we go all the way from looking at the anthropological roots to behavioral neuroeconomics, and essentially the whole the application of this in the real world is to, the goal is to, the question to ask is, how can we funnel human nature and things like self-interest in a kind of conduit of positive sum productivity. And once you kind of grasp that concept, it can be very enlightening concept at an individualistic level for you personally, but of course that kind of scales up to societal issues in organizational structures in organizations and actual companies and universities and so on. It informs legal systems, things like ethics, compliance, politics and public policy. Even leads to understanding how we can do better things like healthcare communication and healthcare dissemination. So how to market content more optimally, more efficiently in health communication. It's based on all this kind of data. It's very, very interesting. And of course there's the kind of back propagation from those societal systems. So there are philosophical, epistemological, historical, social-political, financial constraints that are put on the kind of science research or neuroscience research as well. So all of these things I've just mentioned affects the whole longitudinal life cycle, the kind of the developmental life cycle of research, work in academia, products and services, within education, within science, within the medical field, within pretty much anything. And those are the sorts of things within things like the tech industry. And so these are things I've been involved quite a lot at all stages of development.